Happy Wednesday, Bayou Blitz family and all of Who Dat Nation. I am Bob Rose. I am joined by my broadcast partner, Brendan Boylan, and we both love to welcome you to this Wednesday's edition of the Bayou Blitz Podcast. Brendan, happy belated Halloween to you and your family. I hope you're doing well tonight.
Yeah, you as well. I joked with you, your yellow shirt, you had a hat, and you belong on Curious George. So just keep that in mind when you pick that as your Halloween costume next year. I planted the seed really early on. But with the holidays around, Bob, I just have to ask you this. I don't know how you and Lauren are at home. Are you guys people that have already put up Christmas stuff? Or is that
No, I won't let her.
Thanksgiving?
I won't let her. Brendan, I worked almost 30 years in retail, and in retail years that translates to about 300 years. And there were too many times that Christmas music was playing over the loudspeaker, or we were forced to put up Christmas decorations before Halloween. Working retail earns you a spot in heaven. No matter what else you've done in your life. So that's why, folks, that I am free to do as much evil as I can, because I already have my have my spot earned. Lauren wanted to put up Halloween decorations in late August, right after Labor Day, and I'm like, yeah, I'm telling on you, dear. We came to an agreement eventually that they get put up October 1st, and that's what happens. She's in charge of decorating the house, but I do get a little bit feisty when certain decorations get put up at certain times. We'll probably put up our Christmas tree the weekend after Thanksgiving. That seems to be tradition with us. But I mean, that young lady works damn near 90 hours a week, it feels like sometimes. So it all depends on her energy level, and when we can both get off some free time off at the same time.
All right, well, I'll tattle on my significant other as well. I sent her a meme today from Bob's Burgers. They're sitting in the living room. Halloween decorations are still up, and there's a Christmas tree in the middle, and Bob goes, "It's the day after Halloween, Lynn." That's my significant other. That's Katie to a T. We have 2 Christmas trees up already. Stockings are already hung at the fireplace, and I just told her, whatever makes you happy, that's what we're here for. So I already have Christmas stuff up. Whether I'm totally for it or totally against it, just put on a smile and say whatever you want to do is good by me. So I'd love to hear other people's comments if we're crazy over here or not.
And see, folks, that's why Brendan Boylan is a much more likable person than Bob Rose. But like I said, I've already earned my place in heaven with my 300 years in retail, so I can be as evil as I want.
I think I'm not evil. I don't think you're that evil. I just, it's just some decorations. I might not agree with it. My mom was the same way, though. My dad had to fight my mom every year to have the decorations put up late. But anyway, football opposed to the holidays, as we're all some of you guys are still recovering from Halloween down there on Bourbon Street, I'm sure. Bob, the Saints finally recovered after a losing streak, and were able to put together a really nice performance on Sunday. Believe it or not, it's their 4th shutout. Only their 4th shutout since 1995, and it's the first time they've shut out an opponent in back-to-back years in a long, long time. Going back to last season, they shut out the Bucs on that 9-0 victory. What stood out to you about that performance? I mean, I think the biggest thing for me was that looking at what we talked about in the pregame and then talked about at halftime, as well, was running the football and winning the turnover battle were going to be crucial. I think the Saints did that really well. And Alvin Kamara, I mean, I know the expectation levels for a guy of his caliber is extremely high, but when you decide to step up and you decide to be a voice in the locker room and kind of call some people out, you have to step up too. And Alvin's certainly done that the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, he absolutely has. And Alvin's really been on a tear statistically over the last month, if you think about it. And you pointed this out in your fantasy articles. But it was, I think it took us all by surprise to see a soft-spoken guy, at least publicly soft-spoken, speak up like he did in the locker room. And that made us raise an eyebrow a little bit. for a couple reasons. Number one, again, that's never been Alvin's nature, and number two, we expected this kind of thing from a Cam Jordan or a Demario Davis or a Jameis Winston, guys like that. So when you put yourself out there like that, and you're not normally a guy to do that, then the microscope, like you pointed out, is completely on you. He delivered big time. So yeah, I mean that offensively, most certainly, that's the performance that caught my attention and impressed me the most. Defensively, and I know I pointed out Alontae Taylor in my Game Ball articles, I specified him, but the performance of the defensive line as a whole, that's what won that game. Obviously Peyton Turner came through with 2 sacks, but I thought Marcus Davenport and Cam Jordan had terrific afternoons. And the defensive tackle position, I will sarcastically say this because I said it about Kamara before he went on his month-long tear a month ago. Defensive tackle spot, welcome to the 2022 NFL season. We missed you for those first 7 games, but man, you guys delivered big time. Maybe not statistically, but click on that game, game review. If you guys have the option, folks, you will see Kentavious Street, David Onyemata in particular, getting penetration all day long from the first Raiders drive to the last Raiders possession. And that's the kind of performance we've been waiting for from this position all year long.
Another position or another player that really stood out to me, Bob, was Peyton Turner, who had 2 sacks on the day. Was a guy who has been banged up with a chest injury and has had a lot of comparisons to Marcus Davenport in terms of being a freakish athlete, but hasn't been able to stay healthy and has had moments and flashes, but hasn't put it all together. So to see him come out and have 2 sacks was a good thing. We have some records to watch out for, and I just want to go ahead and get that done, now and talk about that before it gets lost in the conversation, at least franchise records, that is. And
sorry, John Butler.
Yeah, John Butler tweeted that's what he wanted us to talk about. And hey, Bob, you're wearing yellow. You had your Homer Simpson moment as well, so it's fine. Did I just mention we both run the account? Ooh, secret's out.
Whoops.
No, but nonetheless, Alvin Kamara is now a touchdown shy of Marcus Colston's franchise record for total touchdowns. So Alvin could break that as soon as Monday against the Ravens. Just needs 2. And then Cameron Jordan closing in on the sack total. I believe he's at 2.5 away from Ricky Jackson. Now it might be less than that. I have to double check myself.
I thought it was 3 to tie, Brendan, but okay. I'm not 100% positive either.
Have to relook at some of that stuff, but nonetheless, those are your 2 that we're gonna have to watch out for on Monday night between those guys. I do also want to go ahead and get this out of the way because I've done a terrible job on the account of doing this, but I remembered this week, despite the holiday on Monday, is let's see what you guys want us to discuss today in terms of our polls. We had a couple different options, and our poll was, should Andy Dalton be quarterback 1 for the remainder of the season? Did you guys want injury updates on the receivers? Do we want to talk about Alontae Taylor's stellar week, or do we want to talk about mid-season MVPs? 50% of you voted for should Andy Dalton be quarterback 1 for the remainder of the season. So, Bob, I think that's a great one. Just 10 minutes on the show. They're already hitting us hard and heavy for what honestly was not supposed to be much of a quarterback controversy. And all of a sudden we're here. John Butler says this is his favorite part of the show. Thanks, John. Sorry for ruining part of the conversation for you earlier, but nonetheless, no, I think I'm actually with Bob on that. I think Kamara probably gets the record on Monday against Baltimore, to where Cameron Jordan might be the following week or maybe even the week after. It's hard to predict, especially sacks, because Cam Jordan can have a terrific game. Pressures, hurries, all that, and not get the sack.
Yeah.
Goes to somebody else. So I might even say Cameron Jordan later in the season, but I have a feeling Kamara is going to continue to sniff out the end zone. But, Bob, let's talk about it. Andy Dalton, a guy who is, 36 years old, has played on
35. Stop making people older than what they are.
I'm sorry, Bob. I'm sorry.
I'm sensitive about such subjects.
He just turned 35, right? His birthday was the other day. So
yeah, I'm 36.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, Bob, you're 36. All right. I mean, even if I said I'm like 21, it's not super far off, right? But nonetheless, Andy Dalton, 35 years old, spent a lot of time in Cincinnati. Took him to multiple playoffs, and then bounced around the last couple years. He was with Dallas, and he started some games for Dallas in place of Dak Prescott. Last year, he started a few games for Chicago in place of Justin Fields, and now this year in New Orleans, he's starting in place of Jameis Winston, and looks to potentially be the starting quarterback for the rest of the season. So, Bob, what are your thoughts on what you've seen out of Andy Dalton so far this year? And we had a round piece article come out, last week about who we thought should start for the rest of the year. And overwhelmingly, we all said Jameis Winston. So recap what you were saying about that for the people who didn't read. They should have read, but, we'll let this one slide. And then give a case on why you think Andy Dalton could or should be the starter moving forward.
B, you might let it slide. I won't. Folks, read our articles. Retweet them. It's how we get paid, and we need money. But right after the Arizona game, because of the extra 3-day rest between that game and the Raiders game, this past Sunday, we the Saints News Network decided to come out with a roundtable piece, which we occasionally will do, polling the opinions of Brendan, myself, John Hendricks, and Kyle Mosley on a particular subject. This subject was, if you were Dennis Allen, who would you start in the Raiders game? And like Brendan said, unanimously, we all went with Jameis Winston. The reasons were all pretty similar. Is that statistically, the two quarterbacks, Dalton and Winston, have been put up similar numbers as far as passing yardage, completion percentage. We all acknowledge that Dalton took care of the ball better, gave what the defense, took what the defense gave him more patiently. While we also acknowledged that Winston was the far more explosive player when healthy. But we all also pretty much agreed that because of the age of the two quarterbacks, that you needed to find out if Jameis Winston had any shot at being your future number one quarterback. That's the primary reason that I chose Winston. Therefore, it surprised us all when Allen quickly announced, he did not let this loom. He quickly announced early last week that Andy Dalton would be the starter for the Raiders game. Thereby, there wasn't much reading between the numbers on that one. Dennis was also telling us that he planned on Andy Dalton being his starter for the foreseeable future. You can only surmise that that's because that the coaches feel much more confident in Andy Dalton not turning the ball over. And I realize the two quarterbacks' interception numbers are both pretty close. But remember that 3 of Andy Dalton's 4 interceptions came in one game, and 2 of those were awful interceptions. They're awful for any quarterback. But still, nonetheless, in Dalton's other starts, and now you have to throw in this past Sunday's performance against the Raiders when he did not throw any interceptions at all. There's no doubt that Andy Dalton takes care of the ball better. The offense has run much more efficiently under Dalton. And remember, Andy has not had Michael Thomas for any of his now, 5 starts. Andy has not had Jarvis Landry for 4 of those 5 starts, and he's not had Chris Olave for 1 of those starts. Jameis Winston had all 3 wide receivers for all of his starts. The comparisons kind of tell you why the coaches feel the way that they did. Under Jameis Winston, the Saints have averaged 17 points per game, 373 total yards, given up 11 quarterback sacks. Under Dalton, and this is with only 24 points being scored against the Raiders. under Dalton starts, the team has averaged 30 points per game, 407 total yards, and have given up 4 sacks. Now, let's be fair here. The team has run the ball much better under Dalton. They've averaged 160 yards rushing as opposed to only 112 when Winston was the quarterback. We've already pointed out the difference in the quality of receivers. Winston was the beneficiary of much better defensive play in that first early part of the season, where the defense gave up less than 23 points a game and 323 total yards. Now these defensive numbers are skewed because of the thrashing of the Raiders, but the defensive statistics, since Dalton has been starter, are actually much worse. Coming into the Raiders game, this team had given up nearly 30 points per ball game and about 340 yards per game. So I'm trying to be fair, statistically with both, but like I said, on the field, and this is no knock against Jameis Winston necessarily. It's just that the coaches are obviously more comfortable in throwing a more well-rounded game plan to Andy Dalton. You can hear it if you're watching the game. They're letting Andy Dalton audible. We saw very little of that out of Jameis, either by design or by flaw of the quarterback. For whatever reason, Andy Dalton is able to audible more than Jameis Winston has, even dating back to last year. To me, that shows a certain level of comfort from your coaching staff. These offensive players, they're responding to whatever Andy Dalton is doing on the field. So am I ready to say that we're not going to see another snap from Jameis Winston as a New Orleans Saints quarterback? No, because stuff happens. Maybe an injury happens, knock on wood. Maybe Andy Dalton plays poorly for a game or two. It's going to be desperation time for these New Orleans Saints the rest of the season. So you can't afford back-to-back poor games from your quarterback, regardless of who it is. But if Andy Dalton continues to play at the level that he is playing at, and I grant you, the ceiling for Andy Dalton is much lower than the ceiling for Jameis Winston, but the floor, the minimum amount that you're going to get out of Andy Dalton seems to be much better. And it seems to be something that the coaches are much more comfortable with than you get from Jameis Winston.
Interesting, all those stats and numbers that you brought up, Bob. I think the biggest thing that had me write the way that I did in saying that Winston should be the starter moving forward was essentially the same reason you brought up, was you've already paid the guy. Mm-hmm. He's under contract for next year as well. He's not making great money, right? He's not making franchise quarterback money, but he's not making bad money either. So to have a guy making that much money, I don't think you want to cut Jameis Winston at the end of the year, even if he doesn't start another game. But the feeling in the room was not just fans, but you, me, John, Kyle, a lot of the analysts and writers as well, is that Jameis was going to get a true shot to prove that not only was he a bridge type of quarterback, but he could be, because how young he is, be the quarterback moving forward in New Orleans. And call it unfortunate or not, because he played so well last year before the injury. And then obviously this year, not great. Had the great fourth quarter in week 1, but then got injured again. Call it unfortunate, but I personally would hate to see the opportunity to see if he could be the guy moving forward thrown away because he got hurt. Injuries are a part of the game. You can lose your job to injury. I know that's like a huge debate, even to this day. Can you lose your job to injury? Absolutely, you can lose your job to injury.
Ask Drew Bledsoe.
Exactly. And, for the Patriots, that worked out extremely well for them. Now, for the Saints, I think it's a weird spot, because you have Andy Dalton, who at 35 years old is at the tail end of his career. There's not a whole lot of gas left in the tank, it looks like, for him to be a starter in the league, especially for a team that, because of how bad the NFC South is, still has playoff hope. And you look at a guy like Jameis, who's 26, 27 years old, and you're going, okay, former first overall pick, former Heisman Trophy winner, former Pro Bowler, is thrown for 5,000 yards in a season, is a guy that you are glued to if you're watching TV because of the interceptions and the touchdowns. He's a gunslinger. He's a true gunslinger. I would hate to see his New Orleans career end because of injury, but I understand why they're rocking with Andy Dalton. And I'll tell you my biggest reason. The biggest reason I think, even going into the Raiders game, that Andy Dalton was still the starting quarterback was one thing. And you really harped on it early in the year, Bob, and last year. And it was the lack of production from Kamara in the receiving game, whether it was by design, whether it was by Kamara not being as interested, what have you. Andy Dalton's got the guy the ball.
Yeah.
And yeah, is that a fault? Is that a flaw or a fault of Jameis Winston? Yes, you look at the tape, you look statistically throughout his career, and he's never really done a good job getting the ball to his running backs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you want to play devil's advocate, you look at the quality of running backs he had in Tampa Bay, and you're like, I can't understand.
Right.
I can't understand why you didn't get it to your running backs.
Right.
But nonetheless, Andy's done a really good job of utilizing Alvin Kamara in the offense. Again, whether that's by design or Andy, there's a little bit of both. And he's done a really good job of utilizing the pieces that he's had because he hasn't had super quality pieces around him.
Right. I mean,
shoot, even Juwan Johnson, who I like Juwan Johnson. I think he's a good quality player in this league. Let's face it, Juwan's never going to be like a top 10, 15 tight end in the league, right? But he's a good quality piece. I mean, he had a great day in Arizona. 40 yards and 2 touchdowns. Got plenty of red zone targets. That's what you want out of Juwan Johnson. You look at what Jameis did early in the season, and just it wasn't there. So until Andy either has just an awful performance, an awful string of performances, or B, gets injured, again, like you said, knock on wood, he doesn't, because he's played well, and you never want to see anybody get injured. I think Andy's the guy you kind of let this ride out with. Unless, like I said, the Saints play terrible a couple games in a row, whether it's Andy or the team as a whole, and you're really out of playoff contention, you want to see, is Jameis the guy or not?
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, too, to go back to the original point, is remember, the Saints don't have a first-round pick this year.
Exactly.
Which is another huge reason why I'm thinking, don't you want to see if Jameis is the guy? Because it's not like one of those, like, hey, he's not the guy. We didn't have a good year. We can go draft, whoever. That's not the case. I mean, yeah, you can get a good quarterback or quality quarterback. We've seen guys, Jims, second-round Jims, Drew Brees. Guys like that. Sure, you can. Absolutely. But it's a lot harder to do that than when you have a top 10 pick, in the first round, and you're able to go get a guy who's a top quarterback. So I understand riding it out with Andy Dalton while you're winning, but if it ever gets to a point where you're losing, you have to see for the sake of the team in the future, is Jameis the guy or not? Because we haven't had a full year of Jameis Winston, and it's been a weird transition since Drew Brees because of that. I mean, shoot, how many different starting quarterbacks have the Saints had since Drew Brees retired? 5.
Mm-hmm.
5. Got to find some consistency. And while I like what Andy Dalton's been able to do, Andy's not the long-term answer. Jameis at least could be.
Brendan, I agree with that he could be, and I've said that he could be. And that's also one of the reasons why I wrote my part of that roundtable was, if I was Dennis Allen, I would start Jameis Winston because of that very reason, to see if he is. I think when as soon as Dennis Allen made the call that Andy Dalton is my quarterback, that told us that as long as Dennis Allen is the coach, Dennis Allen does not believe that that Jameis Winston is the quarterback, that they've already made up their mind, whether we agree with it or not, that's apparently what seems to be the case. Now, to be fair too, news also came out that Jameis has been dealing with a torn ligament in that foot that he injured in preseason. So that could play a small part in it. But you got to believe that if you're the head coach of the New Orleans Saints and your number one quarterback, who you believe, the guy who you believe is your franchise quarterback, is able to take the field, then you damn well put him out there, regardless of who your backup is. And that's why I think Dennis Allen making this decision tells us that he believes that Jameis Winston is not the answer as far as the starting quarterback in the year 2023. And like you pointed out, the Saints do not have a first-round draft choice. They have lots of questions already on that roster. If we're going to fast forward 6 months into the offseason, defensive tackle, safety, backup running back, maybe wide receiver, maybe tight end. We could get, and now you add quarterback onto that. Like you said, you can find a Drew Brees in the second round, a Tom Brady in the seventh, a Dak Prescott in the fourth. But we all know, ladies and gentlemen, that the later you wait to select a quarterback, the statistical odds of you hitting on one goes monumentally down. To have any, and I know the landscape is littered with high first-round busts, but as overdrafted and overanalyzed as the quarterback position is, you really, realistically, in today's day and age, you realistically have to be at least in the top 10 to have a shot at finding your quarterback, your franchise quarterback of the future. Now, it's one thing for the Saints to not have a first-round draft choice next year. If they identify someone that they really like in the mid, even in the late or even middle part of the first round, you can juggle some future assets to get back up into the position. But if it's a quarterback that you're desperately in need for, and you have identified that you need to get into the top 10 or higher to get that guy, you don't have the assets realistically to do it without mortgaging your current stardom and well into your future. And that's the 8 ball that the Saints are behind right now.
Absolutely. And just to further your point, I mean, you look at the quarterbacks that the Saints have drafted over the years, over the last years. Can we not? Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are 7th rounds, whether you're looking at like Palco, Canfield. The one that sticks out that wasn't the 7th round pick was Garrett Grayson, and that didn't go well, whether for his time in New Orleans and elsewhere. But, nonetheless, Tommy Stevens was technically a quarterback, right? That transition outside. But anyway, I mean, you look at it and yeah, I mean, look at all those guys I listed. Did any of them last in New Orleans more than a year? No, they didn't. And unfortunately, the Saints really haven't hit on they haven't had to, but they haven't hit on a quarterback at all. And I think the only time they were really trying to hit was Garrett Grayson. And we don't need it. That's a whole nother podcast, Bobby. Before we go into some of the things moving forward to the Ravens game, I do want to recap some of the Raiders a little bit more. Gypsy wants to know what we thought of the shutout. I think the one thing about the shutout is I didn't see it coming. You and I both had this being a tight game in our pregame show. I actually had the Saints losing the ball game because I thought the Raiders, and I still think the Raiders are a very talented team. But, I've said it a gazillion times before, whether it be on this podcast or other podcasts. The NFL is not Madden. It doesn't matter what kind of roster you put together.
Right.
The cohesion has to be there. And there's just something about this Raiders team that's off. I can't really figure out what it is. The offensive line is not great, so be it. The secondary is not great, so be it. But you have a top 5 receiver in football. When healthy, and he got banged up at the end of the game, but when healthy, Jacobs is a really good running back in this league and a guy they have a big decision to make on this offseason. And I think Derek Carr, it wasn't that long ago that if Derek Carr didn't break his leg, the Raiders were going to the AFC championship game, right? Yep. It wasn't that long ago. I mean, Derek Carr is still a very quality quarterback. I'd call him a top 15 quarterback in football. He's in the top half of starters in the league.
I'd love to have him in New Orleans. Yeah, if he was available in 2023, I'd take Derek Carr in a second in a New Orleans Saints uniform.
In a heartbeat. So when you have that kind of talent and you look defensively, and I mean, they're not bad there either, there's just something that's not there. Now, in the defense of the Las Vegas Raiders, they haven't. We just talked about the Saints not hitting on some draft picks at the quarterback position. You want to talk about guys that just haven't hit at all or had very misfortunate first round picks the last couple years? Las Vegas.
Yeah.
That's been brutal. But I don't think that's the biggest reason for this team being, 2-5? And you look at the roster and they shouldn't be. I thought the Raiders would come in and kind of put some things together. I mean, shoot, they played the Chiefs really well. The Chiefs, one of the better teams in football. And they just weren't able to. I think some of that had to do with the Saints defense, but I was pleasantly surprised with how well, not just Alontae Taylor, whether it was Paulson Adebo, I mean, whoever was on Devontae Adams. Adams finished with one catch for 5 yards on the screen pass. That's it. You were able to shut down one of the best receivers in football. I wrote about it in my By the Numbers piece. I mean, it wasn't until I guess they technically crossed midfield with 2:17 left in the ball game, but they didn't take a snap over midfield until after the 2-minute warning.
Right.
I mean, that's incredible. That's incredible. I mean, the Saints defense did such a good job. I think special teams for the Saints needs to be credited too for the field position battle that they won. And the Saints offense wasn't spectacular. I mean, a lot of it rode on the back of Alvin Kamara, quite literally. But they did enough to win the ball game and win the ball game comfortably. Can that be replicated against a team like the Ravens? I don't know. I mean, Lamar Jackson is incredible. The funny thing is, and I've said this for a long time, think what you will of the guy, and obviously he played for a rival team. But Mike, I credit Mike Vick for a lot of what we're seeing out of quarterbacks now, even over the last decade. The RG3s of the world and Lamar Jacksons and the Kyler Murrays and whatever. Man, if you put Michael Vick in today, I think he'd be better than Lamar Jackson. Just a personal opinion. That's a different debate for a different day. I think he's got a better arm than Lamar, at least in strength. But anyway, Lamar Jackson is I don't want to say once in a generation, but he could be a once in a generational type of talent. Their problem is they don't have a running back. You have J.K. Dobbins, who looked like to be a pretty good hit, can't stay healthy. Gus Edwards battling some injuries. So there's some question marks at running back. Receiver-wise, maybe the biggest knock for the Ravens over the last couple years is who's their receiver? Who's he going to get the ball to? And they've done a really good job of converting their kick returner out of Texas into being a little bit more of a playmaker as a receiver, kind of like what we wanted to see out of Deontay Hardy, and then obviously a little bit of what we're seeing out of Shaheed as well. I just think the Ravens offense is super, super talented. I don't know if it can be replicated, but for me, Bob, it was good to see the Saints defense take a step in the right direction, because coming into the game, they don't have Marshawn Lattimore. That's a big hit. The safeties hadn't played that well. That's a big hit. Lots of questions at defensive tackle. Outside of Cameron Jordan, is it going to be Davenport? Is it going to be Peyton Turner? Who's it going to be that's going to come up and play well and take some pressure off of Cameron Jordan? And I think at least in this game against the Raiders, you had answers for every one of those questions. And did the safeties play great? I don't know about great, but probably the best game they've played since they've been in New Orleans. Matthew comes up with an interception. I think Pete Werner is like a hidden gem this year. Maybe not to you and I, or maybe not to the fans, but at least to the national media. I mean, Pete Werner, he's played incredible football this year. And that's a bright spot too. So I look at this game and I see a lot of bright spots and I see some positivity for this team moving forward. But it's going to be, can you replicate that throughout the season? And can you replicate that against a very run-heavy team on Monday night?
Yeah, and that's the biggest question right there. Coming into the Raiders game, I outlined what I thought were the keys to that the Saints needed to pull off defensively. And number one was shut down the run. I mean, Josh Jacobs had been on an unbelievable tear, over 140 rushing yards in 3 straight games. Came out of this one with 43 rushing yards. I thought that if the Saints could shut down the Raiders, and I mean stall the Raiders running game from the get-go, that Josh McDaniels would lose patience, and that's exactly what happened. Therefore, I always thought that the game would have to be won in the trenches by that defensive line, and they did everything that they needed to do. They checked off every box. They pressured from the edge. They shut down the run in the center, but they also got interior pressure. They were able to do so without blitzing, which allowed Werner and Demario Davis to flare out wide, take care of Jacobs if he came out of the backfield, or spy on Carr if he broke containment, which did happen a couple of times. The one thing that I was surprised about, I figured without Marshawn Lattimore that we would not see a lot of physical matchup man coverage. That's where they surprised me, because they did exactly that with Adebo and Alontae Taylor. Now the safeties, I agree with you. Collectively, that's the best game I have seen yet out of Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu. And they gave the kind of deep support that was necessary to allow Taylor, Adebo, and even Chris Harris, when he was in the game, to play more aggressively down low. And that's why everybody talks about Devontae Adams being held to, targeted 5 times, 1 catch, 4 yards, I think. But even Hunter Renfrow, 1 catch, 6 yards. Considering that they were without Darren Waller and that their best 2 options were Hunter Renfrow and Devontae Adams, to hold them to a collective 2 receptions is an unbelievable job. Now, like you said, that's a tough ask to do in back-to-back weeks. The Ravens are going to have a different offensive approach. Saints fans, let's not hold out any hope for Marshawn Lattimore being in the lineup this Sunday. He will not be. He will not be. It's not 100% guarantee, but it's about 90, 95% at this point. But the Ravens passing game shouldn't scare you. The Raiders running game should. Or I say Raiders, I meant Ravens. Unlike Vegas, Baltimore will not lose patience with their running game. They have a running attack that's very similar to what Pete Carmichael has been doing with Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram before he was hurt, and Taysom Hill. He's gonna hit you. He's gonna hit you inside. He's gonna hit you with some weird looking quarterback option plays, and he's gonna hit you with some athleticism off the edge and off tackle. That's what kind of attack that the Ravens are going to present. And the off tackle guy, the edge guy, is going to be Lamar Jackson. I know people get upset, but he's a running back that plays quarterback. It's as simple as that. He scares defense. He doesn't scare defenses with his arm. He never has. Mainly because in Lamar's defense, he's never had the coaching to refine those passing mechanics, and he's never had the consistent weapons provided by the Ravens to give him a well-rounded passing attack. So Lamar Jackson does what Lamar Jackson does best. It's football 101. I will beat you by doing what I do best, and that's my unbelievable athleticism. I mean, the man is a video game cheat code. But just like with Taysom Hill, a different kind of athlete, but just like with Taysom Hill, you know what's coming. Now I dare you to stop it. And more often than not, teams can't. Lamar already has 553 yards rushing. He's on pace for well over 1,000 yards on the ground as a quarterback. And it's not like he's the only facet of this rushing attack. Like you pointed out, Brendan, J.K. Dobbins, I think he's back on injured reserve. But they'll come at the Saints with Kenyon Drake, Justice Hill, and Gus Edwards. And those guys have a combined almost 700 yards on the ground. This team is averaging 166 yards on the ground. They're not going to lose patience if the Saints stop them early. The challenge for New Orleans is stopping them throughout the game, and at the same time preventing the over-the-top plays that Lamar is capable of beating you with those no-name receivers, Devin Duvernay and Rashad Bateman, because those guys are capable of beating you downfield. Outside of that, I think the Saints have the coverage weapons, or the coverage ability with Davis, Werner, and those corners underneath to take care of the tight ends. That's who Lamar is going to be targeting more often than not if the big play down the field is not there. Baltimore does not have the wide receiver weapons to beat teams on those intermediate routes, but they do that with their tight end position.
I was going to say Duvernay too. I mean, remember that's who I was comparing it to being a Shaheed or a Deontay Hardy. I mean, they'll use him in so many ways because he's such a dangerous return man. He was an all-pro return man a year ago. And you know how that is. If you just go and off the mentality as a return man, just looking for that space and be able to hit it at full speed. I mean, that's the type of guy that this one is. Dobbins is on IR. Gus Edwards is going to be questionable. Re-aggravated, I believe it was his hamstring last week. So you have a guy like Kenyon Drake, who's been a speedster his whole career. Combine that with Lamar, Duvernay. I mean, there's so much speed on this team. That's what makes it scary. They've had a couple different tight ends over the years come in and out of Baltimore, have some success. And that whole unit is built for success because of what Lamar Jackson brings. But you're absolutely right. I mean, what was the biggest knock on Lamar coming out into the draft was the passes were almost lofted. There wasn't a lot of zip on them. And he's proved some people wrong in being a better passer than people made him out to be.
He has. I attribute poor coaching for not refining those mechanics and making him a more accurate passer.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's the thing, unfortunately. Again, different podcast topic for a different time. You can go through some of the greatest quarterbacks in college history that could not make the transition to the pro game because their mechanics were never fixed. They had okay pro careers, or they had moments in the pros, but that was it because, they were running these spread options similar to what Lamar, a guy like Tim Tebow even, where they were really successful with their legs. They just never figured it out. Sidebar, I've always hated the comparison of Taysom Hill and Lamar Jackson. I'm sure we're going to hear it a gazillion times throughout the week. I've always hated it because they are two completely, not even just quarterbacks. They're very different runners, right? So different. Lamar's going to be your more agile speedster to where Taysom does have speed. I mean, shoot, he ran like a 4.344.
Right.
But he's bigger. He's going to bruise you. I mean, he's ran linebackers over. Completely different. So let's just not talk about that, Bob. I know you won't. You might throw it in there.
And I brought it up because so many others will. The only comparison, apples and oranges are both fruits, but they're very, very different fruits.
Very fair.
Taysom Hill and Lamar Jackson are both running quarterbacks when they're behind center.
Yep. That's
where the comparison ends. Like you said, you're comparing a tank. Which, by the way, tanks are a lot faster than what people think. But what are tanks known for? Running over things. You're comparing a tank to a Ferrari. You're okay with running a tank into a brick wall or through a wall of a building. You're not going to try to do that with a Ferrari, though.
Right. Very, very good point, Bob. Very good point. Yeah, I'm not looking forward to all those comparisons this week.
Yeah,
I'm just not. If you're feeling up for it, Bob, though, you could spite me and throw it in an article that you write just because I'll see it. I'm just kidding. But no, I think the biggest thing with New Orleans this week is, and they've struggled at times this season, containing the run. I mean, you go early into the year, some of those statistics you were throwing up when Jameis was playing quarterback for New Orleans. I mean, they were just trounced, on the ground. They've cleaned it up a little bit, and you look over the last couple of years, and the Saints have continuously been great against the run. But are you going to be able to do it against a team that is built to run the ball like a college offense? In all honesty, look at any other team in the NFL. Does any other team in the NFL run the ball as much as the Ravens do? No other team's built to do that. But you just talked about, for a guy like Lamar, I'm going to beat you because I'm going to do the things that I'm good at. You have to credit the Ravens for drafting Lamar Jackson and then just completely recreating their playbook to complement the things that they were good at. They didn't try to fit a square hole or a square peg into a round hole. They adjusted when they drafted Lamar Jackson. So props to the Ravens, because there's a ton of teams that draft quarterbacks high that don't do that. They just try to make them a player that they're not.
Oh yeah, and that's why John Harbaugh, and I despise his brother Jim. I despise Jim Harbaugh like he wronged my family. But John Harbaugh is one of my favorite coaches in the entire National Football League. And that's one of the reasons why. John Harbaugh won a Super Bowl with a drop back passing attack led by Joe Flacco, who is never going to be confused with forget the comparison between Taysom Hill and Lamar Jackson. Compare Joe Flacco and Lamar Jackson. Flacco couldn't get out of his own way then. And like you said, they drafted Lamar Jackson. And they completely renovated their entire playbook in a snap. And they have been, he hasn't won a Super Bowl with it. But more often than not, the Ravens are legitimate playoff, if not Super Bowl contenders.
I mean, he's got an MVP. I'd say you did pretty good when you draft a guy and he ends up becoming the MVP of the league because you were willing to not make him someone he wasn't. And that's what makes the Ravens special. Now, the one knock on the Ravens that I'll have from over the years is, you look at the Ed Reed, the Ray Lewis days, and those dominant defenses. They're behind Baltimore. They're not a bad defense, right? But they're not that dominant force that you think of. Now, if you took like the Ray Lewis defense of years and you combined them with this rushing attack that Lamar Jackson has, that's a marriage made in heaven right there. You're winning the Super Bowl multiple times.
Yeah.
They're not that anymore. That DNA is still sprinkled in there somewhere, but you got to use a microscope now to find it. What are some things that the New Orleans offense that has played much better over the last couple of weeks, Bob? What are some things that they can exploit with this Baltimore defense?
Baltimore has a lofty ranking against the run. They rank 5th in rush defense. But a little bit closer look reveals they have yet to allow a 100-yard rusher, but they've allowed 5 players to have at least 70 yards on the ground, including Josh Allen. And if there's a quarterback with the running style that you want to compare to Taysom Hill, it's Josh Allen.
It's a good one.
So, I think that if the Saints remain patient, that they should be able to run the ball against the Ravens, who they have a lot of talent in their front 7, but a lot of it is in the edge position, which means you might be able to hit the Ravens inside and wear them down late in the game because they aren't real thin up the middle, or they aren't real deep up the middle. Now, Baltimore, I mentioned they're 5th ranked against the run. They're only 28th ranked against the pass. They're giving up about 267 yards a game. And that I think that's why they have such a lofty ranking against the run also, because very infamously this year, the Ravens have blown 3 double-digit fourth quarter leads. What's that tell you? That tells you the teams are coming back on them, obviously, but how are they doing it? More often than not, via the passing game. So that does inflate the passing numbers a little bit more than maybe they have a right to be. And that also kind of colors that lofty run defense ranking with smoke and mirrors a little bit. Having Michael Thomas or Jarvis Landry, but we expected if one of the two are going to come back, it's going to be Thomas. Having him come back is going to be key, because I think you're going to need more legitimate receiving targets than just Chris Olave and Alvin Kamara in this one. And remember, Michael Thomas has eaten Marcus Peters alive their entire respective careers. And Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphrey are very good cornerbacks for the Ravens. But I like that matchup between Humphrey and Peters versus a Michael Thomas and a Chris Olave. You have to be careful because the Ravens have always been an opportunistic defense, whether it's under John Harbaugh now or Brian Billick, reaching a couple decades ago. So Andy Dalton is going to have to take care of the football, something that, knock on wood, he has done very good in 4 of his 5 starts. But that Saints offensive line, which has played very, very, very well in the last month or so, they're going to be challenged by that deep edge rusher position. I mean, the Ravens literally have 7 edge rushers that would be top stars on most NFL teams, like featured sack artists. So that's what kind of pressure they can bring on the Saints from the edge. So it's going to be a challenge for especially Ryan Ramczyk and James Hurst. But Andy Dalton, who by the way is pretty familiar with the Ravens, after such a long career in Cincinnati, he's going to have to be on his toes and get rid of the ball quickly. But those Ravens are going to try to bait him into mistakes. So it's going to be a very patient, sometimes almost plodding, like a mud plotter approach by the Saints. It's not going to be pretty at times, but if you take care of the football, if you convert your third and shorts and third and mediums, then you can control the pace of the game against Baltimore. And if you do that, the big plays are going to naturally happen.
You mentioned how good that the Saints offensive line has been the last couple of weeks. One guy I have to shout out because we were all over him earlier this year. Cesar Ruiz has played so much better. So shout out Cesar Ruiz starting to put some things together in year 3. Bob, I'll ask you this. Is the Ravens made a big trade this week, bolstering their defense with a guy that I'm very familiar with while he was at the University of Georgia in Roquan Smith, who, oh man, you talk about a guy who can do it all at the linebacker. Do you expect him to play on Monday? And if so, what kind of impact can he have in his first game as a Raven?
Yeah, I do expect him to play on Monday, Brendan. We'll see what kind of snap count he gets. But I promise you this, that the Ravens defensive coaches gave Roquan Smith a pile of film on Alvin Kamara. And they said, Roquan, welcome to Baltimore. Go lock yourself in a room and get very, very familiar with every single thing that number 41 for the Saints does as soon as he comes out of the locker room and until he goes back in the locker room at the end of the game. So, whatever packages that Roquan Smith is going to be in on, it is going to be very, very focused on his athletic skill set versus what Kamara can do on the edge of the Saints offense and as a receiver. Because, everybody is going to talk about Roquan Smith. Oh, he's such a good pass rusher. He's a solid run defender. Yeah, he is very good at both of those. But the Ravens got him because of his open field coverage ability. That's something that Patrick Queen has struggled at a little bit. As athletic as Queen is, he struggled with his pass coverage awareness. And that is something that Roquan Smith does very, very well. So whatever packages Roquan is involved in, it's going to be a lot of third down packages or a lot of plays that the Ravens have recognized on film that these are situations that Alvin Kamara does this in or Alvin Kamara does that in. So I wouldn't necessarily expect Roquan Smith to be on, be in on like 85, 90% of the plays, but the plays he's involved in are the plays that the Saints like to use Alvin Kamara on, passing plays near the goal line, things like that.
Is Roquan Smith a top 5 all-around linebacker in football?
I don't know about top 5. But he's if he's not, he's close. Therefore, he's definitely top 10.
Very talented, very talented. That was the biggest thing coming out of Georgia is the fact that, you get a lot of guys in the first round, or even early second round at linebacker. And, they might have an A+ in the run game, but their pass, it's like a B-. Roquan comes out, and it might not have been A+, but it was A+ and an A. Yep. I mean, all across the board. And it's just grown in his NFL career. A little surprised to see that the package that came back for him, I thought he would have attracted some more. But obviously there was some disconnect between him and the Bears, and he wanted out, and I think he landed in a really good spot. But looking at the Saints, we talk about their rushing attack. You talk about Alvin Kamara. Well, Alvin Kamara is a little bit of a one-man band this week. He's going to be without his running mate, Mark Ingram, not just this week, but for a few weeks. Ingram has an MCL sprain, definitely avoided what could have been a much nastier injury, especially for a running back of his age. Yeah. But they expect Kamara to be back, or rather Ingram to be back in, 3 to 4 weeks. Now, the Saints did have some movement, bring some guys onto the practice squad, releasing some others. One position we didn't see was running back, Bob, and a lot of people have already forgotten. Jordan Howard, a former Chicago Bear, since we were just talking about the Bears, is on the Saints practice squad. Do you expect Howard to get called up and kind of play that role of running back 2 in Ingram's absence, because this is certainly a guy that we talked about when he joined the practice squad. A veteran in the NFL, but not to the point of Mark Ingram, a guy that could certainly be running back 2 for New Orleans for a couple years potentially.
Yeah, I do expect Jordan Howard to get called up. And you and I both liked the addition of him to the practice squad when it happened a few weeks ago. In fact, we were calling for it even in the offseason, as a bolstering to the depth of that running back unit. Howard brings the same kind of skill set that Ingram does to the offense. He's a very physical runner, between the tackles guy. He's not a 3 yards in a cloud of dust runner. He does have some pop when he gets into the open field, but he's mainly the guy that's going to pick you those tough yards between the tackles. So I absolutely think that Jordan Howard is going to get activated this week, especially since, and I know a lot of people are either surprised or disappointed that the Saints didn't make a move for a running back at the trade deadline. Folks, that was never going to happen. Again, we just talked about it earlier, the lack of draft capital that this team has. They like the pieces that they have in the room. They acknowledge the Ingram injury, but as long as, knock on wood, as long as Kamara stays healthy, he's the bell cow of this offense. They're not going to give up future draft picks, of which they don't have a lot of, for a guy that's going to play 8 to 10 snaps a game, if that. Because here's the thing. It didn't matter. While I expect Howard to be activated, he wasn't going to get even the same amount of snaps that Mark Ingram was getting. Because make no mistake, folks, Taysom Hill is your number 2 rushing threat in that offense. And Brendan, I know you agree with this too. Jordan Howard will get activated mainly because you only have Dwayne Washington if he doesn't. But Howard will probably only be used for short yardage, maybe near the goal line, and very specific packages where they want to line Kamara up outside, but they still want a legitimate running back in the backfield. That's going to be it. I would be surprised if Jordan Howard got any more than 3 or 5 touches in this game.
If you guys are curious with what Jordan Howard brings to the table, just go to YouTube and type in something like Jordan Howard and Tariq Cohen. Very similar type of backfield. Obviously, that was more of a split backfield. But in terms of Cohen being more of your traditional scat back, you can kind of say that of Alvin Kamara. And seeing what Howard brought to that offense, that's going to be something that he's going to be able to bring to the table. You're absolutely right, Bob, with Taysom Hill. And I hate to do it because I don't want to say I was wrong, but he is a guy that now you have to look at in fantasy in Taysom Hill. Because I used to say, well, just the production. I mean, I remember having a conversation, I think it was like week 2 of the season. Like, the guy's only getting 5 touches a game. Why would you add him to your roster? And now all of a sudden you're like, well, like it hasn't quite doubled, but it's like 8 or 9. And you're like, well, is he really like the red zone and goal to go back for the Saints? You're like, kinda. Do you want to roll the dice week in and week out? Not really, but if you absolutely have to, it's not a bad spot. Having me eat my words a little bit. I wouldn't start him like willingly, but if you have to, it's not a bad option. But I also believe in the theory of it's really the soccer theory is when a player scores a goal, the floodgates open, right? After it's been a drought. For Kamara, it was a drought of touchdowns. I think the floodgates are going to open. They kind of semi-opened with 3, but I really think Kamara is going to start getting a lot more looks in the red zone. So fantasy owners, I mean, obviously, while there's no Michael Thomas and there's no Landry and that whole mess, and there's no Ingram now, Kamara, not Taysom Hill, should be the guy you're really relying on for touchdowns, and I think the Saints offense is going to run that way as well. Bob, 1 minute left in the show. We'll obviously have a lot more on Sunday for the pregame. But so let's do this. Biggest takeaway, good takeaway from the Raiders game, biggest bad takeaway from the Raiders game. So give me a negative and then let's end it with a positive.
Wow.
Because even in a shutout victory, there's negatives.
Sure. Negative. The kicking game. Tom Biola, I hope you're watching because I'm going to use your line from last week. When Lutz shanked that field goal at the end of the first half, my thoughts were of what Tom Biola said on our show last week: kicking is for losers. I said on our halftime broadcast that I was terrified that field goal would come back to missed field goal, which was very very makeable for a Will Lutz kicker. I thought that missed field goal would come back to haunt them. Blake Gillikin still has not overly impressed me as a punter this year directionally. He seems to be still very inconsistent, not hit his groove yet. So when you're playing a team as sound as the Baltimore Ravens in all three phases, and John Harbaugh is a former special teams coach himself, so he values special teams as much as anybody. When you're not performing well in the kicking game, either place kicking, punting, your special teams coverage for the Saints was much better. But those small things can lose you a football game. So I know it seems a minute detail, but Lutz is still not the Will Lutz that we're used to seeing, and Blake Gillikin is not the 2021 Blake Gillikin. That's what concerned me coming out of the Raiders game.
Well, and keep in mind, just to bounce off that point, you look at the Ravens special teams, and we already mentioned Duvernay, who was an all-pro return man a year ago. You can make the argument to be the best kicker probably the best kicker of the last decade in Justin Tucker.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, they already have the upper hand on special teams. The Saints have to be solid there. For me, I think it's an easy out to say this, Bob. So I'm sorry. You took the more difficult route. But the easy negative here is still not seeing. It's the same thing we saw last year with the receivers. Nobody has stood out.
Olave.
Obviously Olave. But out of the returners from last year that are in a much similar situation with last year, and I'm really looking more towards Marquez Callaway because I think the expectations were so high for Callaway last year to make that jump. And he's a good receiver. He's a solid backup receiver. He could have a long NFL career as receiver 4.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. But I haven't seen him step up. Kevin White, as much as I'm rooting for the guy, haven't really seen him step up. My guy Keith Kirkwood continues to get waived. I mean, there's just nobody stepped up. And at some point, somebody has to.
I'll tell you, Rashid Shaheed is slowly carving out a role in this offense, man.
I really think he is. I mean, that might be a bright spot, but just disappointed that, you even Traquan Smith. I mean, you have guys that you're expecting these guys now, veterans in the NFL, to step up. And they haven't. So, positives, Bob, before we close out the show. Positives from the Raiders game outside of the, well does.
Yeah, I mean, Andy Dalton, not enough people are talking about how well Andy Dalton has played. But the quarterback is always easy to point the fingers at. We already talked about Kamara. You mentioned Cecil Ruiz. Hurst and Ramczyk did such a fabulous job on Max Crosby and Chandler Jones last week. But I'm going to go back to the position that I pointed out early in the show, the Saints defensive line. That entire unit put out a monstrous effort on Sunday. I mean, they were in Carr's face all day. They were on top of Josh Jacobs in the backfield as soon as he got the handoff. That's what kind of performance that this team is going to need against Lamar Jackson and his stable of remaining, whoever's left standing as far as the Ravens running backs go. As well as Alontae Taylor played and as well as Adebo played, and I think that's underrated. Same with DeMario Pete Werner. We're used to spectacular accomplishments for them. The Saints defensive line won last Sunday's game for that unit. And it needs to be doing the same thing again. I was so impressed by what I took away from that unit from edge to edge.
I'll go on the other side of the trenches. You kind of gave me a little a pathway into it, if you will. But the offensive line has progressed week to week. Because the first couple weeks, and you have the numbers in front of you a little bit better than I do, but I mean, Winston got hit a lot those first couple weeks, and Dalton has been hit a lot less. And particularly on Sunday, Dalton really wasn't scrambling for his life. And part of that,
3 pressures on Sunday.
There you go. 3 pressures on Sunday. And I gave a shout out to Ruiz because a lot of people were on him and he's played so much better. I mean, you got to give shout outs across the board. Even a guy like Andrus Pete, who's been the butt of all jokes, despite the multiple Pro Bowls that he's been selected to, played really well. Hurst, who in the offseason, a lot of people were upset Hurst was going to be starting over Penning, which is a name that I haven't said in a while. But Hurst has played really well. Ramczyk, who didn't start the year very well, which surprised a lot of us. And same with Eric McCoy. I mean, you can go one by one on this offensive line. They didn't impress. And now all of a sudden, I mean, they're back to being a really cohesive group that might be one of the best offensive lines in football, edge to edge, or tackle to tackle. So definitely going to give some props there. So that's the positive. That's not the, they shut him out. We'll go with the Saints offensive line because the 2 things quarterbacks love, good offensive line play and a strong running game. And Andy Dalton got both of those last week.
Yep.
Made his life really, really easy. And I do agree that Dalton deserves a lot more praise for how well he has played. But, you look at the Saints, multiple Saints starters over the last little bit, even going back to Teddy Bridgewater. And there's been some stretches where Saints quarterbacks have played pretty good football. Outside of Trevor Siemian. Sorry, Trevor. But nonetheless, Bob, that's all the time we have for the Bayou Blitz podcast, episode 50. Can you believe it's 15 episodes already? Wow. But where can everybody follow you on the World Wide Web?
Folks, thank you for tuning in tonight. I know I speak for Brandon when I say we love you, and we love everything that you have done for us, all the support and appreciation you've given us. Hopefully you continue that. Spread the word out. Remember, this is your product. This is your show. We're just your mouthpieces. So, pass the word around to other Saints fans who maybe don't have access to social media or don't have as much access to social media. Put the words Bayou Blitz on the tongue of every single Saints fan that you can. Talk about it when you in your get-togethers. Talk about it in your Facebook groups, on your Twitter pages. When you get together with fans at games, talk about it. Talk about us. Talk about it as your show. Hey, you want to listen to my show? And play it for them. Give them some replays. You guys have done such a great job for us so far. Make this a nationwide monster. We thank you for the progress that we made. It's all because of you, and hopefully you keep that ball rolling. In the meantime, you can follow me, Bob Rose, over on Facebook, or at Bobby R 2613 on Twitter. All of my work is available through those 2 pages, but also through the Saints News Network, at Saints News on Twitter. And Brandon and I stream everything that we do through our Bayou Blitz Facebook group and the at Bayou Blitz Pod Twitter page.
Whoa, you remembered the Twitter page.
I stuttered a little bit, but yeah.
Incredible. I'm so proud of you, Bob.
It's that 36-year-old memory I got going.
36. Yep. All right, Bob. I'll make sure I write that on your birthday card this year just to make you happy. Happy 36th birthday. For myself, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at BT Boylan. You can follow all of my work with the Saints News Network, along with all of my stuff with my production company, Bottom of the Mug Productions. I have some really exciting stuff coming up with that, as well as we head into the new year. In the meantime, like Bob said, head over to saints.media, read up on some of our recap articles from last week, and of course, previewing this week, Monday Night Football against the Baltimore Ravens. Guys, again, we thank you so much for tuning into the Bayou Blitz podcast. Bob and I are going to sit down and have a serious talk this week. We owe them a giveaway. If you recall, we owe a t-shirt giveaway because I was incorrect on the team that Taysom Hill had 100 yards on. You were correct. You corrected me. I had my NFC East teams confused. We owe somebody a t-shirt out of my, I can't say fat wallet, but my non-slim, maybe slim wallet. But nonetheless, I owe you guys a t-shirt. We're going to have a serious talk about that. And we will get you some details on Sunday through the pregame show and through our Twitter as well. Until Sunday, guys, make sure that you find peace.
Monday.
Monday.
We got our freak show is moving to Monday night this week.
Oh man, thank you. I misspoke, but you're right. See, now I owe somebody another t-shirt. Bob, you can't keep correcting me on live air. Oh man. But until Monday, you guys find peace, spread love, practice positivity, read some articles, and we'll see you guys Monday night for the preview of the Saints and Baltimore Ravens. We'll see you then.